At 11 p.m. on a Sunday night, the spine of America's heartland snapped. A century-old steel bridge, a vital artery for the nation's supply chain, gave way. Not to an earthquake, not to a planned demolition. It was defeated by a river that had simply grown too powerful to contain. Just 5 hours earlier, a freight train rolled across those very tracks. 5 hours. And at that exact moment, hundreds of miles away, a 114-year-old concrete dam was being overtopped by a different river, unleashing a force so violent it didn't bother breaking the dam. It just carved a new path around it, erasing the land, a house, and a century of certainty in a single afternoon. This wasn't one disaster. It was two. A coordinated assault by water on infrastructure that was never designed for this reality. So what happens when the very ground you stand on becomes the threat? Let me know your thoughts on that below. The Midwest is drowning in a crisis that experts are calling a 1,000-year event, an event that is now happening every few years. The question is no longer if our defenses will fail. It's what happens when we realize they already have. If you're getting value from this kind of in-depth reporting and want to understand the forces reshaping our world, hit that subscribe button. A huge number of you who watch these reports forget to, and subscribing is the single best way to support this independent journalism. Now, let's begin. This story begins with the soil itself. For weeks, between mid-May and mid-June of 2024, the Great Plains were soaking. A series of relentless storm systems left the ground receiving between 150 and 200% of its normal rainfall. Fields that should have been preparing for summer harvest were instead becoming swamps. The earth was full. There was no more capacity. It was a debt that had been accumulating for a month, unseen beneath the surface. Then came June 20th. A stationary weather boundary stalled over the region, a meteorological wall drawing an endless plume of moisture directly from the Gulf of Mexico. It wasn't a normal storm. It was a fire hose. Over the next 3 days, 15 inches of rain fell. In some isolated pockets, 18 inches. It fell on ground that could not absorb another drop. The result wasn't just runoff. It was an instant conversion of rain into flood. Every dried-up creek became a torrent. Every river swelled beyond its banks, not in days, but in hours. The National Weather Service began issuing alerts that sounded more like prophecies. In Spencer, Iowa, the Little Sioux River was about to do the unthinkable. The old record, set back in 1953, was 20.2 feet. By June 23rd, the river crested at 21.4 feet. It didn't just break the record, it shattered it. Clay County's emergency management coordinator, Eric Tigas, gave a quote that perfectly captured the terrifying absurdity of the moment. When the flood gauge is underwater, he said, it's really high. The tools built to measure the disaster were themselves casualties of it, but it was on the border of South Dakota and Iowa that the scene turned apocalyptic. The Big Sioux River, a major tributary of the Missouri, was raging. It was carrying the runoff from 3 states, a muddy, violent wave of water moving with terrifying force. On its banks stood a BNSF Railway bridge, a critical link between Sioux City, Iowa, and North Sioux City, South Dakota. The bridge had stood for over a century. It was an unassuming piece of industrial architecture, a thing taken for granted, part of the landscape. Until it wasn't. At 6 p.m. on June 23rd, BNSF officials made a critical call. The water was rising too fast. The pressure on the bridge's piers was becoming immense. They halted all train traffic. It was a wise precaution. It was also a 5-hour warning for a collapse that was already inevitable. At 11 p.m., it happened. The central span of the steel truss bridge, weakened by the relentless, scouring current, buckled and then plunged into the Big Sioux River. The sound of twisting metal was lost in the roar of the flood, a link in the nation's economic chain, a path for grain, for goods, for energy, was just gone. Jason Westcott, the emergency manager in Union County, could only watch as the river declared its victory. The river gauge nearby would later show a crest of 42.2 feet. That was nearly 8 feet higher than any flood ever recorded at that location. The infrastructure of the 20th century had just met the climate of the 21st, and it had lost. The cleanup would be a challenge of its own. On August 19th, 2024, crews planted 14 separate cutting charges on the South Dakota side of the ruined structure. The controlled explosions were meant to surgically sever the remaining steel, allowing it to be removed. It was a loud, violent, and necessary end to a structure that had died a quiet, sudden death weeks earlier. A bridge that carried commerce one day was scrap metal the next. We've seen a bridge that carried trains for 100 years get erased by a river in a single night. A few hundred miles away, an even older structure was facing an even stranger fate. Which failure do you think is the more terrifying precedent for America's aging infrastructure? The sudden break or the slow bypass? Tell me in the comments. As the BNSF bridge was surrendering to the Big Sioux, another drama was unfolding on Minnesota's Blue Earth River. Here stood the Rapidan Dam. Built in 1910, a concrete gravity dam 87 feet high and 475 feet long. For most of its life, it generated hydroelectric power. But by 2020, its power-generating days were over. A strange phenomenon known as Brazil ice, a slushy mixture of ice crystals and turbulent, supercooled water, had clogged and destroyed the powerhouse. From then on, it was just a dam, a wall holding back a river. On June 24th, 2024, the water came for it. The same deluge that took the bridge was now pouring into the Blue Earth River's watershed. The river rose with astonishing speed, and soon, water began to pour over the top of the 114-year-old structure. This is the moment where most dam failure stories reach their climax. The moment the concrete cracks, the wall gives way, and a tidal wave is unleashed downstream. But that is not what happened at Rapidan. The concrete held. The 1910 engineering, for the most part, did its job. The river, however, found a loophole. Instead of breaking through the dam, the sheer volume and velocity of the water began to attack the land next to it. It scoured the western abutment, a high earthen bank that anchored the dam to the landscape. The water tore at the soil, ripping out trees, dirt, and rock, carving a completely new channel for itself. The river was walking around the obstacle. A home located perilously close to that western bank simply vanished, its foundation undercut, until the entire structure was consumed by the newly rerouted river. The dam was no longer a dam. It was an island in the middle of a raging torrent. Videos from that day are surreal. They show the concrete structure, defiant and largely intact, while the river rampages through a path that was solid ground just hours before. Nature hadn't broken the engineer's wall. It had just redrawn the map. Governor Tim Walz quickly pledged state funds to manage the crisis, but the real work was just beginning. Blue Earth County Public Works was now faced with a problem that had no easy solution. Do you spend millions to repair the embankment and force the river back into its old channel? Do you remove the now obsolete dam entirely? Or do you accept that the river has made a choice and adapt to the new reality? The consequences go far beyond the dam itself. The bypass unleashed a massive pulse of sediment, decades of accumulated silt and earth from the reservoir floor, into the downstream ecosystem. This is a form of pollution that can choke out aquatic life for miles, altering the very chemistry of the river. The National Science Foundation saw this not just as a disaster, but as a unique, terrifying laboratory. They awarded emergency grants to Dr. Zach Hilgendorf and Dr. Philip Larson, earth scientists from nearby universities. Their mission, to use drones and advanced mapping technology to study the geomorphological fallout, to understand how a river behaves when it is suddenly set free. They weren't just studying a dam failure, they were studying the birth of a new landscape created by a force that simply refused to be contained. The story wasn't just about steel and concrete, it was about people's homes. And in North Sioux City, South Dakota, in a neighborhood called McCook Lake, the flood wasn't just rising, it was digging. As the Big Sioux River breached its levees, the water didn't just inundate the streets. The current was so powerful that it began to function like a hydraulic excavator. It scoured the earth beneath the asphalt roads, beneath the foundations of homes. And then the ground began to open up. Massive craters, some dozens of feet deep, appeared overnight. Roads collapsed into the abyss. and then the houses started to go. Imagine watching the street in front of your home dissolve, and then feeling your own foundation start to give way, your house tilting into a chasm that didn't exist a day ago. This wasn't a flood, this was an excavation. One of those homes belonged to Kathy Roberts. She, like her neighbors on Penrose Drive, watched in horror as the neighborhood was literally eaten by the flood. Her home was destroyed, swallowed by the raging current. The trauma of the event was compounded by what she and other residents described as a chaotic and delayed response from the state. This is where the disaster in South Dakota became a national political story. The governor of the state was Kristi Noem. She declared a state of emergency, but residents on the ground, like Kathy Roberts, were vocal in their criticism of the response, feeling abandoned as their lives were washed away. On July 26th, more than a month after the initial deluge, Governor Noem officially requested a presidential disaster declaration, a move critics said was far too late. If you know someone living through these events, or anyone who needs to understand the real stakes of our overloaded infrastructure and changing climate, share this report. It's a story more people need to see. And hitting the like button tells the algorithm that this is a conversation worth having. The controversy might have remained a local political issue, a story of tragedy and anger in a small community. But then, in December of 2024, President-elect Donald Trump nominated Governor Noem to lead the Department of Homeland Security, the federal department that oversees FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the very agency responsible for the national response to disasters like the one that just devastated McCook Lake. Suddenly, the criticism from people like Kathy Roberts was being aired on national news. How could a governor whose administration was being accused of fumbling a state-level flood response be put in charge of the entire country's disaster preparedness? The question hung in the air, a political storm cloud gathering over the flood-ravaged landscape of South Dakota. Noem's nomination put a magnifying glass on the craters of McCook Lake, turning a local catastrophe into a flashpoint in a national debate about competence and accountability. The flood hadn't just destroyed homes, it had ignited a political firestorm. The terrifying truth is that 2024 was not an anomaly. It was a data point in a rapidly escalating trend. It was a warning that is still not being heeded. Fast forward to June of 2026. The pattern returns. A multi-day severe weather outbreak begins to crawl across the plains. In western Nebraska, a tiny town called Bayard found itself directly in the path of a hyper-localized deluge. Between June 8th and 9th, 2026, up to 8 inches of rain fell in a matter of hours. This is the kind of rainfall that should have wiped Bayard off the map. It should have been a story of total destruction. But it wasn't. Because Bayard had a secret defense system. A series of small, unassuming flood control dams built in the 1950s as part of the Wild Horse Drain Watershed Project. One dam in particular, Wild Horse Dam Site 5A, took the brunt of the storm. It held. The North Platte Natural Resources District, the NPN-ERD, later estimated that this single, old-fashioned earthen dam prevented roughly $400,000 in damages to the town. Scott Shaneman, the NPN-ERD's general manager, put it perfectly. This storm demonstrated exactly why watershed infrastructure remains so important, he said. While residents may not see these structures every day, these dams quietly protect homes. Bayard was a success story. A case study in how forgotten, forward-thinking infrastructure from a previous generation can save a community in the present. But that success story was an exception. Just a few weeks later, on June 27, 2026, the same weather pattern shifted east. The fire hose of moisture targeted the hills of Kentucky. In Madison and Jackson counties, the rain came too fast. Flash floods tore through communities with breathtaking speed. It was not a slow-rising river. It was a wall of water. 4 people were killed. A statewide emergency was declared. 2 years after the 1,000-year flood in Iowa and South Dakota, the system was still producing the same catastrophic results. The Midwest and the Ohio Valley were trapped in a cycle of saturation and deluge. The successful defense of Bayard proved that protection was possible. The tragedy in Kentucky proved that, for most places, it wasn't present. the events of 2024 weren't the end of the story. They were the prologue. To understand how abnormal the 2024 floods truly were, you have to understand the benchmark. For an entire generation of Midwesterners, the flood to end all floods was the Great Flood of 1993. It was a cataclysm. It lasted for months, killed 50 people, and reshaped the conversation around flood control on the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. It was the historical yardstick against which all other disasters were measured. In 2024, that yardstick was broken. In Iowa, the Iowa Flood Center at the University of Iowa watched its statewide sensor network get overwhelmed. Rivers were not just hitting flood stage, they were cresting at levels that their scientific models, built on decades of data, including 1993, had classified as statistically remote. Theoretical. Consider Spencer, Iowa. Again, the 1993 flood was bad, but the record there was set in 1953. For over 70 years, that number stood as the absolute worst-case scenario. The 2024 flood surpassed it by more than a foot. On the Big Sioux River, the story was even more extreme. The 42.2-foot crest didn't just beat the 1993 record, it beat it by a staggering 8 feet. That isn't a new record, that is a new reality. It's like a high jumper, not just clearing the bar, but landing on the other side of the stadium. The old assumptions were obsolete. In March of 2019, a bomb cyclone had already given the region a preview of this new world. That storm caused billions in damages and left 1/3 of Offutt Air Force Base, the headquarters of U.S. Strategic Command, completely underwater. It was a stunning wake-up call. A military nerve center crippled by a flood. Yet the lessons were not fully learned. The infrastructure that failed in 2019 was, in many cases, the same infrastructure that was overwhelmed in 2024. Century-old rail bridges, dams built before the Dust Bowl, levee systems designed using rainfall data from the 1940s and 50s. The entire system was built for a climate that no longer exists. It's an analog network trying to survive in a digital storm. I know this is the second time I'm asking, but telling an in-depth story like this, with verified facts and on-the-ground reporting, is only possible because of viewers who decide to support the channel. Our subscriber-funded model is how we avoid clickbait and get to the truth. If you're finding this report valuable, please take a single second and hit the subscribe button. It ensures we can keep doing this work. It makes all the difference. The problem is not just the water. It's what the water brings with it and what it leaves behind. The bypass at the Rapidan Dam was not a clean break. As the Blue Earth River carved its new channel, it was also flushing a century's worth of sediment from the bottom of the reservoir. This isn't just mud. It's a thick slurry filled with nutrients, agricultural runoff, and potentially even legacy contaminants that had been safely sequestered at the bottom of the lake. This sediment plume traveled for miles downstream, fundamentally altering the river's habitat. It smothers fish spawning grounds, blocks sunlight needed by aquatic plants, and can lead to massive algae blooms that suck the oxygen out of the water, creating dead zones. The NSF-funded research being done by Dr. Hilgendorf and Dr. Larson isn't just academic. They are trying to answer a critical question. How long does it take for a river to recover from this kind of trauma? Can it recover at all? Their drones are meticulously building 3D models of the new river channel and the sediment deposits, creating a digital twin of the disaster to predict its long-term effects. This single failure event could impact the health of the Blue Earth River, and by extension, the Minnesota River it flows into, for decades to come. Meanwhile, at McCook Lake, the danger may just be beginning. Those massive craters aren't stable geological features. They are wounds in the landscape. The soil is saturated and structurally compromised. What happens during the next major rain event? Will the craters expand? Will more homes be threatened? The era is now a geohazard zone, a place where the ground itself is no longer trustworthy. Rebuilding isn't just a matter of pouring new concrete for roads and foundations. It requires an entirely new level of geotechnical engineering to ensure the ground won't simply liquefy or collapse again. These events force an uncomfortable question that goes far beyond any single state. A question about the fundamental contract between a government and its citizens. We build our towns and cities based on a set of assumptions: that the bridge will hold, that the dam will work, that the ground beneath our feet will stay put. What happens when all of those assumptions are proven false in the span of a single week? The failures of 2024 were not secret. They were broadcast in real time. The BNSF bridge collapse was captured on video. The Rapidan Dam bypass was filmed by drones. The craters of McCook Lake became a national spectacle. The evidence is not in doubt. And yet, the response feels profoundly out of sync with the scale of the crisis. The conversation in Washington, D.C. revolves around budgets and political appointments, while the conversation in Spencer, Iowa, is about where the water line will be next time. The national debate is abstract. The local reality is a basement full of mud. This disconnect is perhaps the most dangerous part of the entire crisis. The problem is a physical one. It's about cubic feet of water per second versus the tensile strength of steel and the stability of soil. But the solutions are political, economic, and social. They require a collective will to invest trillions of dollars in upgrading infrastructure that is largely invisible and taken for granted until the moment it fails. The example of Bayard, Nebraska, shows that investment works. A small dam, built 70 years ago with foresight, saved a town. It was proactive, not reactive. But America is a reactive nation. We rebuild the bridge after it collapses. We debate the dam's future after the river has already bypassed it. We send aid after the homes have already been washed away. This model of crisis response is no longer sustainable in a climate that produces 1,000-year events with terrifying regularity. The floods of 2024 and 2026 are not the end of the story. They are a chapter in a much longer narrative that is still being written. The scientists studying the aftermath, the engineers redesigning the bridges, the homeowners fighting with insurance companies, they are all living in the next part of that story. The part where we decide if we are going to rebuild for the world we have, or if we will just keep patching the infrastructure built for a world that is already gone. The rain will come again. The rivers will rise. The only question is whether we will be ready. The ground in the Midwest is still saturated. The atmospheric patterns that deliver moisture from the Gulf are intensifying, not weakening. The next 1,000-year flood may not be a year away. It may be a month away. The steel can be replaced. The concrete can be patched. But you cannot negotiate with a river. You cannot legislate a storm away. The Midwest is on the front line of a battle it has been losing in slow motion for years. In 2024, that slow motion defeat suddenly accelerated. The bridge collapsed. The river carved its own path. The ground opened up. These were not warnings anymore. They were